Have you ever noticed how someone's disinterest can transform them from ordinary to extraordinary in your mind? That peculiar alchemy where rejection doesn't diminish desire, but somehow intensifies it, making the unavailable person glow with an almost supernatural appeal. You find yourself thinking about them constantly, analyzing their behavior, creating elaborate scenarios where they finally realize your worth. Society tells you it's just low self-esteem or the thrill of the chase. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more primordial, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about love and desire. Because when rejection makes your longing intensify, you aren't experiencing a character flaw. You're encountering one of the most ancient patterns of the human psyche. And that encounter doesn't come with rational explanations or logical defenses. It comes with obsessive thoughts, emotional pain, and a kind of desperate longing most people never truly examine. No, you're not pathetic. You're human. You're not masochistic. You're simply caught in the grip of what Freud recognized as one of our most fundamental psychological mechanisms. There's something profoundly revealing about our attraction to those who withhold affection, because it shatters our conscious narratives about love, dismantles our rational self-image, and reveals a brutal truth. Most desire operates not on presence, but on absence. And most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of unfulfilled longing. Freud once wrote that the psyche fundamentally misinterprets prohibition as value. And this intensification of desire in the face of rejection is actually a manifestation of what he called the pleasure principle colliding with reality. It's what many experience, but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't analyze their patterns. They repeat them blindly. They don't question why unavailability is so magnetic. They simply chase it relentlessly. They're less interested in attainable connection and more in the intoxicating pursuit of what remains just beyond reach. And that makes relationships treacherous because while conscious minds seek happiness, our unconscious has discovered the irresistible power of what Freud called the forbidden object. The person who falls harder after rejection isn't simply insecure. They're operating from a deeper level of the psyche, a level where value isn't inherent, it must be earned, where love isn't given freely, it must be conquered. And maybe that's why it creates so much suffering, so much obsession, so many attempts to finally obtain what is being withheld. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly irrational fixation is a psyche following a script written in childhood, when love often came with conditions, when attention had to be earned, when the withholding of affection became conflated with its worth. They don't want just any kind of connection. They want validation from the very source that denies it. And until that validation comes, they exist in a state of psychological suspension, yearning, reaching, hoping. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's unhealthy, immature, or emotional masochism in disguise. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if that painful attraction to rejection isn't a flaw in your character, but a window into how your psyche was programmed to understand love? The longing that intensifies after someone pulls away is not simply desire, it's repetition. And those who don't understand Freud's concept of repetition compulsion often mistake this pattern for bad luck or poor judgment. But what few people see is that we don't choose this response consciously. It emerges from somewhere deeper, somewhere formed long before our adult capacity for reason developed. Freud believed that we are drawn to recreate early emotional scenarios, not despite their painfulness, but precisely because of it. And maybe that's why so many still confuse love with longing, when in reality they can be entirely different experiences. While most people claim to want happy, secure relationships, this unconscious pattern knows the familiar terrain of uncertainty. And there, in the space between desire and fulfillment, they've encountered the ghosts of their earliest attachments. Childhood moments when love was inconsistent, when affection was unpredictable, when emotional safety existed in a state of perpetual negotiation. Their intensified response to rejection didn't develop in adulthood, but was scripted in those formative years when the psyche first learned the painful equation that what is difficult to obtain must be inherently more valuable. This person knows secure love. They've experienced it. They've had partners who were consistent, available, and genuinely caring. But somehow, that steady affection never ignites the same desperate flame that rejection so easily sparks. And that paradox wasn't created yesterday. It was the result of a developmental period when their young mind was forming its understanding of what love feels like. What registered wasn't the calm presence of security, but the dramatic contrast between absence and presence, between emotional hunger and momentary satiation. What emerged wasn't true desire, but a complex psychological reaction to intermittent reinforcement. And intermittent reinforcement is psychologically addictive because it demands anticipation, creates uncertainty, and promises the possibility of reward. They don't want rejection itself. They want the resolution of tension that would come with finally winning over the person who withholds. They're no longer pursuing an individual, but chasing an emotional state, a psychological resolution. So maybe that's why they seem so irrational to many, because they don't want stability. They want transformation. And that takes more than consistent affection or reliable presence. It takes the conversion of rejection into acceptance, where few are actually capable of providing that specific emotional arc. And that's where many hearts break repeatedly, not because they desire pain, but because they unconsciously seek to resolve an ancient emotional equation that can never be solved through the very dynamics that created it. They don't want to suffer, they want to triumph. Until then, they pursue the unavailable, not by conscious choice, but out of loyalty to a psychological pattern they didn't create but inherited. This person isn't defective. They're enchanted. There's a vast difference between choosing suffering and being unconsciously drawn to familiar emotional landscapes. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this pattern. A world that still equates desire with free choice. A world that still treats attraction as preference, as something under conscious control rather than often operating from the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the psyche. Freud once said that we are rarely in love with the person standing before us. We love the projection we cast upon them. And this person's intensified response to rejection doesn't operate by conscious logic. It follows unconscious association. They hear phrases like, "Why do you want someone who doesn't want you? Why waste time on people who reject you? Just find someone who appreciates you." And inwardly, they understand the rational advice, but feel powerless against the gravitational pull of the unavailable. Because they know what many don't realize, that the heart's mathematics isn't rational. It's associative. It values not what gives freely, but what reminds them of their original struggle for love. They're not looking for happiness. They're looking for resolution of an ancient emotional wound through its reenactment. Someone who unconsciously represents the original source of inconsistent love. And let's be honest, that's not something you consciously seek, but unconsciously recognize. The suffering they cause themselves isn't in what they choose, it's in what they're helplessly drawn toward. They're living proof that the unconscious seeks not pleasure, but repetition. And that disrupts relationships. Available partners feel devalued. Secure connections feel underwhelming. But they aren't deliberately choosing this dynamic. They're responding to an emotional template imprinted before they had any say in the matter. And the magnetic pull of someone who triggers their original attachment wound is by itself a brutal mirror to those still believing in purely rational romantic choice. This person isn't self-destructive by nature. They don't enjoy the pain of rejection. They understand the logical appeal of reciprocity. And for that, they carry a double burden. Both the overwhelming attraction to what hurts them and the intellectual awareness that they should want something different. They desire peace while their psyche demands the familiar chaos. They want stability while experience has conditioned them to chemical attraction to uncertainty. They long for relationships where love flows easily, while their unconscious pulls them repeatedly toward those who recreate the original emotional struggle. And when rejection occurs, it's not just disappointment, it's re-traumatization. When someone finally shows interest, it's not just pleasure, it's temporary relief from an ancient emotional wound. When they find themselves obsessing over someone who clearly doesn't value them, it's not stupidity, it's compulsion. And that internal battle between intellectual understanding and psychological programming is their greatest struggle. Because they don't consciously choose to desire rejection. They're driven by forces largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self, between what they know they should want and what they actually feel pulled toward, is what makes their experience so difficult to resolve through reasoning alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this pattern isn't its irrationality, it's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about human desire itself. Freud taught that civilization rests upon the renunciation of instinct. But what happens when the instinct itself is formed around deprivation? It was precisely that question that exposes why secure love often feels underwhelming to those conditioned to equate love with struggle. It wasn't by choice. It was a psychological adaptation to their earliest emotional environment, where love was inconsistent, unpredictable, or had to be earned through performance. They no longer experience relationships through conscious intention alone. They're influenced by unconscious patterns, and that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why you can't seem to want the people who actually want you? How many times have you felt the mysterious pull towards someone who treats you as an option rather than a priority? This person has felt that too. They once thought there was something fundamentally wrong with them for not being attracted to available partners. But one day they began to understand it's not about the present, it's about the past. And that day, they made the first step towards seeing a pattern that had been invisible, yet controlling their romantic life completely. Their path toward healing is not a straight line. There are days of insight, moments of clarity, nights of wondering why they can't simply reprogram their attractions, but there's also a growing awareness that illuminates what was once completely unconscious. They learned that the allure of rejection isn't random. It's the psyche's attempt to master what once mastered them. The rejection they pursue is a recreation of their original emotional environment. The unavailable person represents not just a potential partner, but an opportunity to finally win the love that was once inconsistent or withheld. And until that unconscious equation is brought fully into awareness, they choose to begin understanding rather than simply judging themselves. Not out of indulgence, but out of the necessity for psychological truth. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight that much of our adult behavior represents attempts to resolve childhood conflicts. They've been shaped by early experiences, formed by attachment patterns, pulled by forces largely invisible to conscious awareness, and drawn repeatedly to what feels like love, but is actually familiarity. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of separating authentic desire from compulsive repetition. They don't want just anyone. They want to unravel the complex knot that has tied rejection to value in their emotional understanding. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding, but emotional reprogramming. And sadly, few undertake this difficult psychological journey. Most still love from patterns they never examine, attracted to dynamics they never question, repeating cycles they never fully see. And if they still fall harder for rejection today, it's because every instance echoes with ancient familiarity. Every withdrawal of affection they experience is a confirmation of their original emotional reality. Every unavailable person they pursue is a recreation of their primary attachment dynamic. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to transform it. And that awareness born from painful repetition transforms their relationship to their own desires. Because a person who has glimpsed the unconscious origins of their attractions becomes psychologically awakened. Not because their pattern immediately changes, but because they've begun to see what was previously invisible. The person who falls harder for those who reject them is not making a conscious choice. Something inside them was conditioned long ago. And it was precisely that conditioning that created both their suffering and the potential for their liberation. Because sometimes only in recognizing a pattern can we begin the long process of transforming it. Freud suggested that bringing the unconscious into consciousness is the beginning of healing. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with the original emotional template, facing the reality of how love was first presented to them. Patterns that weren't chosen, but absorbed during periods when the psyche was still forming its fundamental understanding of what love is and how it operates. They disrupted unconscious repetition by making it conscious. They began saying no to the blind pursuit of what hurts them, not by denying their attractions, but by understanding them more deeply. They learned that their response to rejection wasn't a character flaw, but a psychological adaptation to their earliest emotional reality. And when they stopped simply blaming themselves for their pattern, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing it clearly. First with confusion, then with painful recognition, and finally with the compassion necessary for any genuine transformation. Because someone who has seen the unconscious origins of their attractions no longer judges themselves so harshly for what they didn't consciously create. They learn to notice their triggers around rejection, to honor the reality of their conditioned responses while not being completely controlled by them. They're not instantly transformed. They simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind repetition and repetition observed with growing awareness. They still feel the pull, yes, but they've begun to question its source, not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand rather than simply continue suffering. Their intuition has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their awareness is a new lens. They can begin to distinguish between authentic desire and compulsive reenactment. And they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like immutable fact. Their transformation isn't immediate, it's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom that humans aren't destined to blindly repeat what they don't understand, but can, through awareness, begin to author new patterns, not to deny history, but to transcend its limitations. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological agency, emotional maturity, a person who, though still influenced by unconscious forces, is no longer completely controlled by them. They're in communion with something greater, with their own potential for change. And no matter how deeply ingrained their pattern of falling harder for rejection, nothing remains fixed when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply act out their programming. They observe it with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly drawn toward what hurts them without understanding why. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious repetition to conscious observation changes everything about their relationship to rejection and desire. But they're no longer identified completely with their patterns. They've already begun to see beyond them. And in that seeing, they discovered that authentic love might feel completely different from the dramatic intensity of pursuing the unavailable. There's something profound about the way they now approach their attractions. They don't need to deny their response to rejection. Their awareness is expanding, and it's in that expansion that their true healing lives. Freud said that making the unconscious conscious is the primary task of psychoanalysis, and perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply repeat, has become someone capable of eventually transforming what once controlled them completely. They no longer try to simply fight their attraction to rejection or convince anyone that they should be different. They don't deny the reality of what they feel, because they've learned that psychological patterns change not through denial, but through integration. And when they feel that familiar pull towards someone who doesn't fully value them, they now pause. They don't engage in self-recrimination or defense. They observe with the dignity of someone who's been caught in this pattern enough times to recognize its signature. What few people understand is that this person still longs for genuine connection. They still want to love and be loved in return. But they want it without the dramatic intensity of the rejected pursuer dynamic they've known too well. Because they've spent too long mistaking anxiety for passion, insecurity for love, intermittent reinforcement for genuine emotional value. Now, they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for something different, and that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional romance. It requires self-knowledge. It requires having faced one's own unconscious patterns and still choosing to evolve beyond them. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for growth, a connection where there's mutual valuing, rather, than the recreation of ancient wounds, where both can love each other without the dramatic intensity of rejection and pursuit. And if that seems less exciting than the roller coaster they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point. Because they'd rather find peace than keep repeating pain. And to many caught in the same pattern, that sounds like settling. But it's really just psychological evolution in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down, you too are ready to examine your own relationship with rejection and desire. A relationship that begins with honoring what actually drives your attractions. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both the unconscious patterns you didn't create and your growing capacity to transform them. A relationship that can't be dictated by repetition alone, but must emerge from increasing self-awareness. And if that awareness hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like an immutable aspect of your personality might actually be a pattern with origins you can finally begin to understand. And if this message found you at the right moment or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently struggling with the same painful cycle. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us.